I'm Tony Ruiz of Gold Derby here with Christine Vachon, who has two really interesting projects coming out pretty much side by side: the FX docuseries Pride and Netflix's Halston. And Christine, these are two very different projects, but yet there really does seem to be a thread. What would you say is the thread that ties these two projects together?
Wow, that's tough. I mean, they really are very different. Um, you know, and I'm not sure if I can find a thread besides me. Um, I mean, obviously, I suppose they both celebrate to some degree different kinds of LGBTQIA storytelling, but besides that, I think they're very, very different.
Yeah, Halston is such an interesting project, and I know, having spoken to Dan Minahan, that this was such a long time
Yes.
coming. This project. What were some of the challenges in getting this made? Why did it take so long?
I think it took so long I mean, partly because when Dan and I first, optioned the material, we were both at the beginning of our careers. And it was a very complex story. Uh, and I think it almost took, all those years for us to figure out what the best part of the story was, what the most relevant part of the story was, and also for both of us to gain the maturity to tell that story. I mean, when I look at it now, or in the past few years, what was so extraordinary to me about the story was, continues to be, that collision of art and commerce. Which, if you are working as a producer, a filmmaker, a storyteller these days, you deal with that collision constantly, and it seeps into every part of your life. So Halston's story meant a different thing to me 25 years ago than it does now, and maybe we just had to wait that long so it could become as relevant as possible.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point because along with the story of his creativity and sometimes his self-destructive nature, there's also this this line about the corporatization of art and commerce and how they intersect. Um, it, do you think that Halston, in this era that we have now of multiple outlets through which people can get product, do you think Halston would be better suited to this time than maybe he was in the 80s?
I mean, I think he kind of helped invent this time.
Mm.
I mean, that's really the thing, is that this whole notion of a branded life, of influencers, all of these things we sort of take for granted right now were things that he was playing with at the very beginning. This idea that you could have, you could wake up and put on your Halston slippers and your Halston robe, and light your Halston candle and splash on your Halston cologne, really was brand new at the time. And now we take that for granted, and a lot of designers, Calvin Klein, Diane von Furstenberg, a lot of designers saw what happened to Halston as a bit of a cautionary tale for themselves, and made sure they protected themselves and protected the kinds of empires that they built, I would say, largely from looking over and seeing his influence.
Yeah, he almost seems like in today's world he would be classified as an influencer.
Absolutely.
Was Ewan McGregor gives such a transformative performance in this, and Dan has told me that he really was the only one that could do it. What is the quality about Ewan McGregor that really makes him the only one that could play this?
I had the great good fortune to work with Ewan almost as long ago as we optioned Halston on Velvet Goldmine. And I remember at the time there was a fearlessness about him, just this kind of like, I'm going to give everything to a role, and I'm going to, and I'm really going to open myself up in ways that are incredibly fierce and charismatic for those watching. And Halston's tricky because, you know, Ewan manages to walk that line where I believe you have tremendous sympathy for him, even while he is behaving horribly. You know, you have such a sense always of where he's coming from. And Ewan was really able to bring that to that character.
To me, the real love story in Halston is the relationship between Halston and Liza Minnelli, played so wonderfully by Krista Rodriguez. How much did you know about Krista before she was cast in this?
I didn't know very much about her at all, and I do remember even saying to a friend of mine who works, you know, very high up in theater, I said, "Oh, we've got this great discovery for Liza, Krista Rodriguez," and she was like, "You think Krista Rodriguez is a discovery?" Like, no. Like, all of us have known about how amazing she is for some time. She may be a discovery to you. And I was like, point taken. But boy, am I glad that, you know, however, whether she's a discovery or not, I'm really glad that that she made her way into Halston, because she's extraordinary.
And you know, it's interesting because it is so much of a period, this piece. Were there, and I've talked to both Krista and Rebecca Dion, and about how COVID really shut this production down.
Yes.
In the middle of it. So how difficult was it for you as a producer to get this thing back up and going again?
You know, it was challenging. I mean, and I think for every film series, you know, for any of us working, you know, getting, you know, actually filming something during this year, everything had its own different set of challenges. For Halston, it was the intimate scenes, the you know, Studio 54, how packed to the gills could it actually be? I mean, in a way, once you learned the protocols, that was sort of the scary part of, like, you know, how do we do this? But once you learned what they were, then you just sort of did it and got on with it. That said, you know, there were times, because we were a relatively early production, I think, in COVID, so we were wearing N95s, goggles, and face shields. And now I think the protocols have been eased to some degree. So no one could ever understand each other. So it was a little, I mean, it had a little bit of like who's on first, but it just wasn't funny. It was just a constant, like, you know, until we were practically in each other's faces screaming, which of course you weren't supposed to do. So, so that was tough. It is a true testament, I think, to the skill of our cast, that they were really able to somehow, in all of that kind of like muffled chaos, find their performances. And, you know, they'd rehearse with their masks on. They wouldn't really see each other until we were about to roll. So in spite of all that they were able to find those extraordinary performances.
I can imagine just being in each other's faces with masks on. It's like the ultimate paradox.
It was pretty crazy. And the face shields, when we were shooting outside and it rained, didn't go so well.
Yeah, they don't come with little windshield wipers, unfortunately. The period of Halston actually, I think, segues perfectly into Pride. And I'll be totally honest, I went into Pride probably thinking, oh, I know a lot of this stuff. And what was so amazing to me about the series is that I learned so much and was exposed to things that I thought I knew and things that I didn't even know. Was that one of the ultimate goals with that series?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I was originally approached a few years ago by Refinery 29, who was then acquired by Vice, who's our co-producer on the series, and they pitched to me, you know, would you be interested in becoming involved in this series, and, you know, LGBTQ, and I thought, well, I don't want to become involved in like your standard doc series, because not that I don't love watching them, I do, but, you know, if Killer is going to do something like that, it has to feel like a little bit more provocative, or a little bit more, off the beaten track. So the first thing I proposed was this idea of having a different director do each episode. And, I'm glad I hadn't had much experience with that kind of television before, because if I had, I would have been like, that's a bad idea. But it wasn't a bad idea. It was a great idea. It was just it was a difficult idea sometimes, because, it means that every single episode was sort of its own kind of startup. But FX really emphasized how much they wanted this to be as character driven as possible. So we kind of charged each director with that. And some of them had no experience whatsoever in documentary. But where it led was to really great places, and as you say, places where, stories you didn't know, people you didn't know about, people and circumstances that I think are truly a shock.
How did you go about picking the directors for each episode? How did you decide who was going to be doing what?
Well, at the beginning, it was kind of like I think that we approached Tom Kalin, Yancey Ford, and Cheryl Dunye first, and they kind of picked their episodes, and then as we started, we wanted to really bring in younger voices, different kinds of voices, etc. Andrew Ahn was the last person we brought on, and I remember pitching him the series, actually at the Provincetown Film Festival, telling him that, I'd really love him to come onto it. And he was like, great. So it's each decade. And I was like, Andrew, you get the 60s. Sorry, that's all that's left. And he was like, oh, okay. And of course, he was born many years after the 60s. And I think the fact that he had to take that kind of deep dive into an era that maybe, he didn't know that much about, kind of makes, that freshness comes across in a way that's really great.
I remember watching it, and just even starting with the 50s episode, what was so amazing to me was how really in the 50s, queer people were still kind of on the outskirts, but there wasn't the horrible persecution that we saw with the rise of the religious right in this country. Was that the sort of thing that you would hear about and go, wow, I didn't know that? What were some of those touchstones that just shocked you?
Every episode has one. I mean, in the 50s, that I think it's referred to at some point in the show, the fact that what started to turn things was the states getting more power over the lives of the people that lived in that state. And that perhaps before then, there was more of a people should live the way they want to live. I mean, that's why I love the name of that episode, People Had Parties. Like this idea that people were sitting in a closet, miserable and contemplating suicide. And of course, there were some people like that, but there were also people who were able to have their lives, So that was, in the 50s, that's definitely there. I think, in the 60s, one of the great things I think that Andrew touches on is the fact that, it didn't start with Stonewall. And most of us think it did. And the fact that there were, other riots and other uprisings beforehand that all kind of paved the way. And of course, I think for a lot of people, Bayard Rustin is a true discovery. The fact that, there he was at King's side, at Dr. King's side, every step of the way. And people had no idea who he was, again, I could go on and on. The 70s, Cheryl's focus on Barbara Hammer is just, I think,
that was one of the major discoveries for me.
Isn't that amazing?
I think and that's what I think is so important about this series, is that we have this younger generation of queer people who this is all real history.
That's right.
And especially when it goes up against these these forces in our educational system at certain state levels that are trying to suppress this history. Do you actually see this as something that would be a tool that could be a tool of education for queer youth?
I do. I mean, one of the gratifying things about, trolling Twitter, which I do occasionally to see what people are talking about, if people are talking about Pride, is the number of people who are like, I had no idea. I didn't know, like, you've got to see this because you will not believe, that this, X, Y, or Z happened, and that is really, that's pretty great, and I sent the link to my daughter's high school history teacher. She's not in high school anymore, but just because I was like, I hope you show this to your students.
Oh, I can imagine that, we're in Pride Month and, it's 2021 and in many ways things have gotten better, but in other ways, the fight still continues. Where do you think the queer movement is right now?
I mean, that's one of those, the simple answer is I have no idea. One of the things I love about Yancey's episode, the 90s, is how he really holds up a mirror to those culture wars and our culture wars, and how they're so different and yet the same. And and of course the pandemic has brought up a lot of, a lot of a lot of feelings about the last pandemic I lived through, which was, the AIDS crisis. So I don't know. I think that as we're sort of crawling out of this pandemic, and really, there's a lot of examination about how do we make things better, and what do we do with the fact that this extraordinary disruption, just pulled the blanket off of all this inequality, and in every sort of sector of how we live. And I think everybody is grappling with what does that mean, and what does that mean for my business, for storytelling, filmmaking, television making, whatever we call what I do now. So I think we're at a time, I always say times of great disruption bring great opportunity. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying what I said at the beginning, which is I have no idea.
Well, they're two really important projects, and I think especially this Pride Month, they really do a service. Everybody go to goldderby.com, make your predictions for the Emmys, and stay tuned with interviews with more contenders throughout the season. Christine Vachon, thank you so much.
My pleasure.